At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized my name had been replaced with a price tag. I noticed it the moment the young woman at the reception table handed me the card with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The cardstock was thick, elegant, the kind you'd expect at a venue that charged more per plate than I used to spend on groceries in a week. And for a brief second, I felt a quiet pride because I knew I had paid for most of this beauty, the flowers, the band, even the imported champagne chilling somewhere behind the bar. But then I looked down and read the words, written in delicate calligraphy. The old lady who's paying for everything. And something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, precise movement like a lock clicking into place. I didn't gasp. I didn't call anyone over. I simply adjusted the brooch on my pale blue dress, the one my late husband used to say made me look like I belonged in a painting. And I pinned the card to my chest as if it were exactly what I had expected to see. Then I smiled and walked into the ballroom. Because if there is one thing you learn after 67 years of life, it's that people will always reveal themselves if you give them enough silence. The room was breathtaking, tall ceilings draped in soft ivory fabric, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over rows of perfectly arranged tables, each centerpiece a careful balance of roses and eucalyptus. I had approved every detail myself weeks ago when Emily asked for my opinion, her voice sweet, her eyes hopeful. Grandma, I want this day to be perfect. And I had believed her, believed that this was about love, about family, about honoring something meaningful. But as I moved deeper into the room, I began to notice the subtle shifts. The way Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, stood near the entrance greeting guests with a polished smile, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if she owned not just the moment, but the entire narrative of this family. When her eyes landed on me, they flickered for half a second, not surprise, not guilt, something closer to calculation. And then she walked over, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Margaret, you made it," she said, her tone warm enough to pass for affection, but thin if you listened closely. I returned the smile. "Of course I did," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I wouldn't miss Emily's wedding." Her gaze dropped briefly to my name tag, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw it. The confirmation, the quiet satisfaction. She knew exactly what it said. She had made sure of it, but she didn't mention it. Instead, she gestured toward the main hall. "Everyone's here, smile politely, and play my part. And I will, at least for now, because sometimes the most powerful move isn't reacting, it's waiting, watching, and letting people show you exactly who they are before you decide what to do next." I sat there as the ceremony unfolded, the soft music filling the room, the kind that was meant to make people feel something warm and hopeful. But all I could hear was the quiet echo of those words pinned to my chest, and I let my eyes move slowly across the guests, observing the small things I might have missed before, the way people leaned toward each other when they spoke about certain topics, the quick glances in my direction followed by polite smiles, and then I heard it, not loudly, not meant for me, but clear enough. "That must be her," a woman whispered to the man beside her. "The one who paid for all of this." And the man chuckled softly, not cruelly, just casually, as if I were not a person but a role, a function, something expected and already understood. I kept my expression calm, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. But inside, something was aligning. Pieces of a pattern that had been scattered for years. I thought about the meetings leading up to this wedding, the way Vanessa had insisted on handling all the logistics, how she would smile and say, "Margaret, you have done so much already. Let me take care of the rest." And I had agreed because it felt like trust, because it felt like being included. But now I realized it had been something else entirely. It had been control, and I remembered the invoices she had sent me, the carefully worded emails, the subtle reminders about deposits and deadlines, always framed as gratitude, but always ending with a number, always ending with a transfer. And I had paid them, every single one, not because I was asked directly, but because it was understood, because somewhere along the way, I had allowed that understanding to become normal. The music shifted, signaling the start of the processional, and everyone stood, chairs scraping softly against the floor. I rose with them, smoothing the fabric of my dress. And as I turned slightly, I caught sight of Daniel, standing near the front, his expression composed, his attention fixed on the aisle, and for a moment, I searched his face for something familiar, something that reminded me of the boy who used to hold my hand when he was nervous. But what I saw instead was distance, not hostility, not even indifference, just a quiet separation, as if he had stepped into a life where I no longer quite fit. And then Vanessa moved closer to him, adjusting his tie with a gentle touch, whispering something that made him nod. And I watched them, really watched them, the ease between them, the shared understanding, the way decisions seemed to pass silently from one to the other without question, and I realized that whatever had been planned here, whatever message had been written and pinned to me, it had not been done alone. The doors at the back of the room opened, and Emily appeared, radiant in white, her smile bright, her eyes shining with the kind of excitement that only comes once in a lifetime, and my heart softened despite everything, because she was still my granddaughter, still the little girl who used to run into my kitchen asking for cookies. And as she began to walk down the aisle, I felt a brief, genuine warmth, a reminder of why I had said yes to all of this in the first place, why I had written those checks, why I had trusted that this day would be about love. But as she passed by, her gaze flickered toward me, and for just a second, I thought she might have noticed, that she might have seen what was written on my name tag. But if she did, she gave no sign. She kept walking, her smile never wavering, and I understood then that whatever had been done here had been accepted, whether knowingly or not. The ceremony continued, vows were exchanged, promises were made, and everyone applauded at the right moments. But I found myself paying less attention to the words and more to the spaces between them, the subtle cues, the small confirmations, the way Vanessa's friends laughed a little too easily when money was mentioned in passing, the way the officiant thanked those who made this day possible, and Vanessa's eyes drifted briefly toward me before returning to the couple. It was not overt, not something you could point to and call out, but it was there, woven into the fabric of the event, and I sat through it all without reacting, without interrupting, because I knew now that reacting would only confirm the role they had assigned me, and I was not ready to do that, not yet. Instead, I let the ceremony reach its natural conclusion. I joined in the applause. I even smiled when Daniel glanced in my direction, offering a brief nod as if acknowledging my presence. And when everyone began to move toward the reception area, I stood slowly, taking a moment to adjust the name tag once more, ensuring it was clearly visible, perfectly aligned, exactly where they had placed it, because if they wanted me to wear it, I would, at least for now, until the moment came when it would no longer mean what they thought it did. The reception hall felt brighter than it had a few minutes ago, but not in a way that brought comfort. It was the kind of brightness that exposes everything, every detail, every expression that might otherwise go unnoticed. And as I stepped inside, I could already hear the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter that seemed just a little too sharp. I moved slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to take in the arrangement of the room, the long tables dressed in white linen, the gold-trimmed plates, the place cards standing neatly beside each setting, and I noticed how mine had been positioned, not at the center table with the immediate family, but slightly off to the side, still visible, still respectable, but not quite where I would have expected to be after everything I had contributed. I did not question it. I simply walked to my seat and placed my hands gently on the back of the chair before sitting down, and as I settled in, I became aware of the conversations unfolding around me, subtle at first, fragments of sentences drifting through the air. She really went all out for this wedding, someone said, followed by a quiet reply. Well, when you have someone footing the bill, why not? And there it was again, not cruel enough to cause a scene, but precise enough to define me in their eyes. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, keeping my movements measured, controlled, because I understood now that this was not just about a name tag or a misplaced seat. It was about a narrative that had been carefully constructed, one that reduced me to a function, a source, something dependable but not necessarily respected. And as I looked toward the head table, I saw Vanessa moving effortlessly among the guests, her smile flawless, her posture confident. She greeted people by name, laughed at the right moments, accepted compliments with a graceful nod, and when someone mentioned how beautiful everything looked, she responded with practiced ease. We wanted to make it special. emphasizing the word we just enough to claim ownership without ever acknowledging the foundation beneath it. I watched Daniel beside her, raising his glass, shaking hands, thanking guests, and I searched again for something familiar, something that suggested he might recognize what was happening. But his expression remained composed, as if this entire evening were unfolding exactly as it should, and I realized then that whatever line had been crossed, it had not been accidental. It had been accepted, perhaps even encouraged. The server approached with a tray of champagne, offering a glass with a polite smile, and I accepted it, holding the stem lightly between my fingers, the bubbles rising slowly to the surface, and I thought about the years that had led to this moment. The birthdays, the holidays, the quiet acts of support that had never required acknowledgement, because I had never needed it. I had believed that being there was enough, that showing up consistently, offering help when it was needed, would naturally build a sense of mutual respect. But respect, I was beginning to understand, was not something that simply grew on its own. It had to be recognized, maintained, and sometimes defended. The music shifted again, signaling the start of the toasts, and guests began to take their seats, the room settling into a more focused energy. I placed my glass back on the table and folded my hands in my lap, my gaze steady, my expression calm, because I could feel it. Now, the moment when everything would begin to reveal itself more clearly. Vanessa stepped forward first, tapping her glass lightly to gather attention, her voice carrying easily across the room as she began to speak, thanking everyone for coming, sharing a few carefully chosen anecdotes, each one polished, each one designed to present a certain image, and as she spoke, she gestured toward different people in the room, acknowledging contributions, offering praise, and when her eyes briefly met mine, there was a pause, almost imperceptible, before she continued. And of course, we are grateful for all the support that made today possible. The words were general, broad enough to include anyone, but the way she said them, the slight tilt of her head, the quick glance in my direction, made it clear that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was acknowledging without honoring, referencing without respecting, and the guests responded with polite applause, some turning their heads toward me, others simply nodding as if everything had been appropriately addressed. I joined in the applause, my hands moving together softly, my expression unchanged, because reacting now would serve no purpose. It would only reinforce the role that had been assigned to me, and I was no longer interested in playing that role on their terms. Instead, I listened, I observed, I allowed the evening to continue, because every word, every glance, every carefully constructed moment was adding to something larger, something that was becoming clearer with each passing minute. And as the applause faded and the next speaker prepared to stand, I adjusted the name tag once more, ensuring it remained visible, perfectly positioned, because if they were going to define me this way, then I would let them, just long enough for them to believe it completely, just long enough for the truth to matter when it finally came to light. The next speaker was Daniel, and as he stood up, adjusting his jacket with a practiced motion, the room quieted in anticipation. I watched him carefully, not just as my son, but as a man presenting himself to an audience, his voice steady, confident, the kind of tone that suggested control. He began with gratitude, thanking the guests, the venue, the staff, each acknowledgement delivered smoothly. And then he turned toward Emily and her new husband, offering warm words about love, commitment, and the future, the kind of speech people expect at a wedding, the kind that earns nods and soft smiles. But I listened for something else, something beneath the surface, something that might reveal whether he understood the weight of what had been done. And as he continued, I noticed the pattern, the way he carefully chose his words, the way he framed everything as a shared effort, a collective achievement. "We are so proud to have brought this day together," he said at one point, his hand gesturing lightly toward Vanessa, and she smiled in response, a quiet exchange that did not include me. And I realized that this was not just omission, it was intention, a deliberate reshaping of reality where contributions could be absorbed, rebranded, and presented as something else entirely. The guests applauded at the right moments, some even raising their glasses in agreement, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because I understood now that acknowledgement was not something they were willing to offer freely. It was something they believed they controlled. Daniel's speech continued, moving into stories from Emily's childhood, small memories meant to create connection. And as he spoke, I found myself recalling those same moments, but from a different perspective. I remembered the afternoons I had spent picking her up from school, the weekends when she stayed at my house while her parents were busy, the quiet conversations over warm meals, the steady presence I had offered without expectation, and yet none of that existed in his version of the story. It had been edited out, replaced with something cleaner, more convenient. And as he reached the end of his speech, he raised his glass, inviting everyone to join him in a toast, to love, to family, and to the people who made this day possible, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. And again, the words were broad, inclusive, but empty of specificity. The kind of statement that sounds generous but costs nothing. The room responded with applause, glasses lifted, smiles exchanged, and I followed the motion, lifting my own glass, letting the light catch the surface of the champagne. And for a brief moment, I considered what it would mean to accept this version of events, to allow myself to be folded into their narrative, to remain the quiet supporter, the invisible foundation. But that thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something more certain, because I had begun to see the pattern not just in this evening, but in the years leading up to it, the gradual shifts, the small decisions that had gone unquestioned, the ways in which my role had been defined without my input. And as Daniel sat down, Vanessa leaned in toward him, whispering something that made him smile, their exchange private, self-contained. And I realized that whatever boundaries had once existed between us had been redrawn, not with confrontation. Labeled defined me completely. Then they had made a mistake, one that I intended to let them fully commit to before I chose to correct it. As the music softened and people began to stand, drifting toward the dance floor or gathering in small circles, I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the noise of the room to settle into something I could observe rather than feel. And it was in that stillness that the past began to return to me, not as scattered memories, but as a sequence, clear and structured, like something that had been waiting for me to finally see it without distraction. I remembered the first conversation about the wedding. The afternoon Emily had come to my house with a folder full of ideas, her excitement genuine, her voice filled with that hopeful energy that makes you want to say yes before the question is even fully asked. She had sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped her with homework years ago, and she said, "Grandma, I want something simple but beautiful." And I had smiled, telling her that simple and beautiful were always the best kinds of choices. But within a week, the word simple had quietly disappeared, replaced by venues, caterers, designers, each suggestion presented carefully, almost casually, as if it were the natural next step. And then Vanessa had stepped in, offering to coordinate everything. Her tone helpful, efficient, reassuring. "You should not have to worry about the details, Margaret. Let me handle that," she had said. And I had agreed because it sounded reasonable, because it felt like support. But what followed had not been support. It had been direction. Invoices began to arrive, each one more elaborate than the last, each one framed as necessary, as expected. And every time I hesitated, even briefly, there was always a reason, a justification, a subtle reminder of what this day was supposed to represent. And so I paid, not because I was forced to, but because I was guided to believe it was my role. And as I sat there now, listening to the distant laughter and the soft rhythm of music beginning to fill the room, again, I could see how easily that role had been shaped, how gradually it had been defined. I thought about the house Daniel and Vanessa had purchased 3 years ago, how they had come to me with a carefully prepared explanation about market conditions, about timing, about opportunity, and how I had written a check to help with the down payment because it seemed like the right thing to do, because I believed I was contributing to something stable, something lasting. And I remembered the holidays, the gifts, the quiet transfers that were never labeled as obligations but always carried the same expectation. And I realized that none of it had been accidental, none of it had been isolated. It had been a pattern, consistent and deliberate, and the wedding was simply the most visible expression of it, the place where everything converged into a single, undeniable statement. I looked down briefly at the name tag resting against my dress, the ink precise, the wording intentional, and I understood now that it was not just a careless joke or a moment of poor judgment. It was a summary, a definition that had been built over time and then presented publicly as if it were universally accepted. And what struck me most was not the insult itself, but the confidence behind it, the assumption that I would accept it without question, that I would continue to smile, to support, to exist within the boundaries they had set for me. And as I lifted my gaze back to the room, I saw Vanessa again, standing near the bar now, speaking with a group of guests, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, and I noticed how easily she occupied the space, how naturally she carried the authority of someone who believed she was in control. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had been avoiding. That control had not been taken from me. It had been given, slowly, piece by piece, through trust, through habit, through the quiet assumption that intentions were shared when they were not. And I felt no anger as I recognized this, only clarity, because clarity does not need to raise its voice. It simply replaces uncertainty with understanding. And as the first couple stepped onto the dance floor, the lights dimming slightly to create a softer atmosphere, I stood up from my chair, smoothing my dress once more, adjusting the name tag so that it remained exactly where it had been placed, visible, undeniable, because I knew now that this moment, this realization, was not an end but a beginning, not of confrontation, but of correction. And as I began to walk slowly along the edge of the room, observing, listening, allowing the evening to continue exactly as they had planned it, I carried that understanding with me, steady and quiet, because the story they believed they had written about me was complete in their minds. But in reality, it was only halfway told. I moved slowly along the edge of the room, not toward the center where the music and laughter had begun to swell, but toward the quieter spaces where conversations were less rehearsed and more revealing. And it was there, near a tall arrangement of white roses, that I heard my name again, not spoken directly to me, but carried just clearly enough to reach me. Vanessa said she handled everything herself. A woman remarked, her voice light, impressed, and another responded, well, she is lucky to have that kind of support behind the scenes. And I paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to register the phrasing, behind the scenes, as if I were not part of the picture, only the structure holding it up. I continued walking, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because I understood now that the narrative had been carefully positioned not only within the family but extended outward to the guests, shaped through small statements, repeated, just enough to become accepted truth. And as I approached the bar, I saw Vanessa again, laughing softly at something one of her friends had said, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her presence effortless. And when she noticed me, she offered a polite smile, the kind that acknowledges without inviting. Margaret, are you enjoying yourself? She asked, her tone smooth, measured, and I met her gaze steadily. It is a beautiful evening, I replied, keeping my voice even, and for a moment, there was a pause between us, not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken, something that neither of us chose to address directly. She nodded, satisfied, as if my response confirmed exactly what she expected, and then she turned back to her conversation, seamlessly re-entering the role she had constructed, and I stepped away, not because I felt dismissed, but because I had already seen what I needed to see. I made my way toward a small table near the side of the room where a few older guests were seated, their voices quieter, their observations less filtered, and as I approached, one of them, a gentleman with silver hair and a familiar face, looked up and smiled. Margaret, it has been a long time, he said, and I recognized him then. Thomas Harris, my late husband's attorney, a man who had always spoken carefully, who chose his words with intention. I returned the smile. It has, I said, taking the empty seat beside him, and for a moment, we exchanged the usual pleasantries, comments about the ceremony, the venue, the weather, but beneath that surface, there was something else, something quieter, and after a brief pause, his gaze shifted slightly, not to my face, but to the name tag resting against my dress, his expression changing just enough to signal that he had noticed, that he understood, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that it remained between us. Your husband always believed in clarity, he said, his tone measured, and I felt a small steady recognition settle within me, because I knew what he meant, not just the words, but the principle behind them. I nodded once. He did. I replied, and Thomas reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, retrieving a small envelope, plain, unmarked, and he placed it gently on the table between us, his hand resting on it for a brief moment before he spoke again. He also believed that respect should never have to be negotiated, he said quietly. And I looked down at the envelope, not opening it yet, not needing to rush, because the weight of it was not in the paper itself, but in what it represented, a structure, a safeguard, something that had been prepared long before this evening, long before any of this had become visible. I lifted my gaze back to Thomas, meeting his eyes with a calm understanding, and he gave a slight nod, as if confirming that the timing was no longer coincidental, that the moment had arrived naturally, without force, without confrontation, just as it should. I placed my hand lightly over the envelope, not claiming it, but acknowledging it, and for a few seconds, we sat in silence, the sounds of the reception continuing around us, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it unchanged, all of it moving forward as if nothing had shifted, and yet something had, something quiet but definitive, because while the room continued to celebrate a story that had been carefully constructed, I now held a piece of something else, something that had been written long before this evening, something that did not rely on perception or presentation. And as I finally picked up the envelope, holding it with steady hands, I felt no urgency, no need to react immediately, only a clear sense of timing, because whatever came next would not be driven by emotion, but by understanding, and understanding, once it is complete, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I held it lightly in my hand as I stood up from the table, thanking Thomas with a small nod that carried more meaning than words, and I walked back toward the center of the room where the music had grown louder, where the dance floor had begun to fill with couples moving in slow circles under the soft glow of the chandeliers, and everything looked exactly as it should, laughter rising, glasses clinking, cameras flashing to capture moments that would later be framed as perfect, and I moved through it all quietly, not avoiding anyone, not hiding, but not seeking attention either, because I understood now that timing mattered more than presence. And as I reached the edge of the dance floor, I paused, watching Emily and her husband as they shared their first dance, her smile genuine, her happiness real, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel that, to separate her from everything else, because not every part of this evening had been shaped by calculation. Some parts were still untouched, still sincere, and I respected that. But even sincerity cannot exist without truth, and truth I now held in my hand. I turned slightly, finding a quieter space near one of the tall windows where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. And it was there, away from the immediate noise, that I finally opened the envelope, the paper inside crisp, carefully folded, and as I read the first few lines, I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper within me. Not shock, not anger, just confirmation. The kind that does not demand a reaction because it already answers the question you had been forming. The document was clear, written in precise language that left little room for interpretation, a clause added to my late husband's estate, one that addressed not finances alone, but conduct, respect, public treatment. And as my eyes moved steadily across the page, I understood the full structure of what had been put in place, not as a punishment, but as a boundary, a condition that had always existed, waiting only for the moment it would be needed. I folded the paper carefully, returning it to the envelope without haste, and I stood there for a few seconds longer, looking out at the lights beyond the glass, allowing the information to settle fully into place, because once something becomes clear, truly clear, there is no need to rush what comes next. It will unfold naturally. I turned back toward the room, slipping the envelope into my clutch, and as I did, I caught sight of Vanessa. Again, now speaking with a small group near the head table, her posture confident, her expression composed, and I noticed how easily she moved through the space, how naturally she carried the role she believed she had secured, and I walked toward her, not directly, not in a straight line that would signal intention, but gradually, allowing a few small interactions along the way, a greeting here, a polite exchange there, each step measured, each moment intentional, until I found myself within earshot of her conversation. It was a lot to coordinate. She was saying, her tone light, almost modest, but I wanted everything to come together seamlessly. And someone responded with admiration, praising her effort, her organization, her attention to detail, and she accepted it with a soft smile, nodding as if it were both deserved and expected, and I stood there just long enough to hear the rhythm of it, the repetition of a narrative that had already taken root, and then I stepped forward, just slightly, enough for her to notice me, and when she did, her expression shifted for a brief moment before settling back into its usual composure. "Margaret," she said, acknowledging me with that same measured tone, and I returned the look, calm, steady. "Vanessa," I replied, nothing more, nothing less, and for a second, there was a pause, a subtle break in the flow of conversation around us, not enough to draw attention, but enough to exist, and then she resumed speaking, continuing her story as if nothing had changed, but something had, not in the room, not yet, but within the structure beneath it, within the understanding that now guided every observation, every choice, and I stepped back again, allowing the conversation to continue without interruption, because I had no need to correct anything in that moment, no need to challenge or expose, not yet. Instead, I let it unfold, let them continue to build the version of reality they believed in, because the more complete it became, the clearer the contrast would be when the truth was finally introduced. And as I moved away once more, returning to the edge of the room where I could see everything without being the center of it, I felt no urgency, no pressure to act immediately, only a quiet readiness, because the next step would not be about reacting to what had been done, it would be about allowing them to stand fully within it, to confirm it beyond doubt, so that when the moment came, there would be no confusion, no room for reinterpretation, only clarity, and clarity, once revealed, has a way of changing everything without needing to raise its voice. The evening moved forward exactly as they had planned it, the music growing livelier, guests filling the dance floor with laughter and movement, and I remained where I could see everything without being seen too closely, allowing the rhythm of the celebration to continue uninterrupted, because interruption was never the point, timing was. And as the band shifted into a slower song, drawing people back toward their tables, I noticed the subtle transition in the room, the moment when attention becomes available again, when conversations pause just long enough for something new to take focus. And it was then that I walked toward the head table, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the same measured pace I had carried all evening, my steps steady, my expression calm. And when I reached the table, I paused just long enough for Vanessa to notice me, her eyes lifting, her smile forming automatically before settling into something more cautious. "Margaret," she said, her tone polite, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her without responding immediately, because words, I had learned, are most effective when they are not rushed. I reached into my clutch and removed the envelope, placing it gently on the table in front of me, not sliding it toward her, not offering it, simply placing it where it could be seen, where its presence could exist without explanation. And for a moment, no one spoke, the small circle of guests nearby sensing that something had shifted, even if they could not yet define it. Vanessa's gaze dropped briefly to the envelope, then returned to my face, searching, calculating, and I met her eyes steadily, allowing the silence to hold. Because silence, when used correctly, has a way of drawing attention. More effectively than any raised voice. Daniel stepped closer, his expression uncertain. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with something he could not quite conceal, and I turned to him, my voice even. "That depends on how you define all right," I said, not sharply, not accusingly, simply stating it as a possibility, and I opened the envelope once more, removing the document and unfolding it carefully, the paper catching the light just enough to draw the attention of those nearby, and I did not raise it high. I did not announce it to the room. I simply held it where it could be seen by those who mattered, by those who had participated in the narrative that had been built. "Your father believed in clarity," I said to Daniel, my tone steady, measured, and his expression shifted, confusion giving way to recognition as he glanced at the document, and Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly. the ease she had carried all evening tightening into something more controlled, more deliberate, and I continued, not raising my voice, not addressing the room, only the people standing in front of me. He also believed that respect was not optional. I added, allowing the words to settle before I spoke again. And I did not need to explain further. The document spoke for itself, the language precise, the condition unmistakable, and I watched as understanding began to move across their faces, slowly, piece by piece. Not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. Daniel's eyes moved from the page to me, searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a way to redirect what was unfolding. But there was nothing to redirect, nothing to reinterpret, because everything that had been said, everything that had been done that evening, had already confirmed the condition in full. Vanessa opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, but no words followed, and I did not press her. I did not demand a response, because a response was no longer necessary. The moment had already completed itself, and the guests nearby, though they could not hear every word, could feel the shift, the subtle change in tone, the quiet recalibration of something that had seemed certain just moments before. And I folded the document once more, returning it to the envelope with the same care I had used when opening it, placing it back into my clutch without haste, because the action itself was enough, the presence of it, the acknowledgement of it. And I looked at them both, Daniel and Vanessa, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a calm clarity that did not need to justify itself. "Enjoy the evening," I said simply, my voice even, and I stepped back, giving them space, giving the moment room to settle fully, because whatever they chose to do next would not change what had already been established. And as I turned away, returning once more to the edge of the room, the music resumed, the conversation slowly picked up again, but something had changed, not loudly, not in a way that disrupted the celebration, but quietly, definitively, like a foundation that had shifted just enough to alter everything built upon it. And I stood there, observing, not as the role they had assigned me, but as myself, fully aware, fully present, knowing that the story they believed in had just met something it could not ignore, something it could not redefine, something that existed beyond perception, beyond presentation, and that was enough. The rest of the evening continued, but it no longer felt the same. Not to me and not to those who had been close enough to witness what had just unfolded. The music still played, people still laughed, glasses were still raised, but there was a subtle restraint now, a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and I could see it in the way Vanessa held herself, her posture still composed but no longer effortless, her smile still present but measured more carefully, and Daniel moved differently as well, his conversations shorter, his attention divided, as if part of him remained fixed on the moment he could not quite process, and I did not approach them again. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to explain, because clarity, once introduced, does not require repetition, it simply exists, and I allowed the evening to unfold without further interference. I spoke with a few guests, exchanged polite words, accepted compliments about the event with a calm nod, not correcting anyone, not reclaiming credit, because that was no longer necessary. The structure had already shifted, the narrative they had built no longer stood on its own, and as time passed, I noticed how conversations began to adjust, how certain phrases were no longer repeated, how some guests glanced toward me with a different kind of recognition, not curiosity, not assumption, but something closer to understanding, and I remained steady within it, not seeking validation, not reacting to it, simply allowing it to settle naturally, because anything forced would lose its weight. And when the evening began to draw toward its close, when the music softened and guests started to gather their things, I moved quietly toward the exit, not announcing my departure, not drawing attention, just stepping away at the right moment. And as I reached the doors, I felt the cool night air waiting just beyond, a contrast to the warmth and noise inside, and I paused briefly, turning back for a final glance, not at the decorations, not at the lights, but at the people, at the structure of the evening that had revealed more than it had intended. And I saw Vanessa standing near the center of the room, her expression composed but her movements more restrained, and Daniel beside her, quieter now, more aware, and I did not feel satisfaction in that, only a quiet sense of completion, Because what needed to be understood had been understood, and what needed to be seen had been seen, and I stepped outside, the door closing gently behind me. The sound of the reception fading into the distance, replaced by the steady calm of the night, and as I walked toward my car, the heels of my shoes echoing softly against the pavement, I reached up once more and removed the name tag from my dress, holding it in my hand for a moment, looking at the words that had been so carefully chosen, and I allowed myself a small, thoughtful pause, not to dwell on the insult, but to recognize it for what it had been, a definition imposed without consent, a role assigned without question. And then I folded it once, neatly, and placed it inside my clutch, alongside the envelope, not as something to keep, but as something already resolved, and I continued walking, unlocking my car, settling into the driver's seat with the same steady composure I had carried all evening. And as the engine started and the headlights cut through the darkness ahead, I understood something with complete clarity, that respect is not something you ask for. It is something you either receive or you do not. And when you do not, the answer is not to argue, not to demand, but to step back and let the absence of it define everything that follows. And as I drove away, leaving the lights of the venue behind me, I did not feel like I was leaving something important. I felt like I was leaving something that had already ended long before tonight, something that had simply taken this moment to reveal itself fully. And I did not look back, because there was nothing left to see, only the road ahead, clear, steady, and entirely my own.